Great, thank you so much. So our next speaker, I want to get to my notes because I practiced really hard, is Tom Regnier, an attorney in South Florida who has taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Miami School of Law. He lectures and publishes widely on the treatment of law in the works of Shakespeare. Tom.
Thank you. My topic is Justice Stevens, the law of evidence, and the Shakespeare authorship question. And this presentation is given in memory of Justice John Paul Stevens, who served on the U.S. Supreme Court from 1975 to 2010. And he was also, you may not know this, author of a law review article, The Shakespeare Canon of Statutory Construction, published in 1992, in which he expressed his doubts about the traditional theory of the man from Stratford being the author, and his belief that it was more likely to be Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And in 2009, Justice Stevens sat for an interview with Jess Braven of the Wall Street Journal, and he also talked about Oxford and about the Stratford man, and he said that the evidence was beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not the man from Stratford. Now, Justice Stevens is not the only U.S. Supreme Court justice to be a skeptic about the traditional theory. Others include Harry Blackmun, Lewis Powell, Sandra Day O'Connor, and Antonin Scalia. And out of those five, three of them believed that this man, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the true author of Shakespeare's works, and that includes Justice Stevens, Justice Blackmun, and Justice Scalia. Strange bedfellows. Okay, so by the way, Justice Stevens is not the only person to write a law review article on the authorship question. I wrote one myself, and I sent a copy to Justice Stevens, and almost immediately he sent me a very nice letter, which I show up here. I won't read it to you, but there's a copy of it on the table out there on the display if you want to take a look at it. And also I was in a delegation in 2009 that presented the Oxfordian of the Year award to Justice Stevens. This is taken in his chambers, and this was for his brave stance in the Wall Street Journal article. So why have so many Supreme Court justices, as well as many other judges and lawyers, come to have doubts about the theory that the man from Stratford was the author of Shakespeare's works? Well, that's because in order to study law, you have to be well trained in the law of evidence. So let's just look at a few basics about the law of evidence. First of all, I just want to clear up the difference between evidence and proof, because a lot of people get these confused. What is evidence? This is from Black's Law Dictionary. Evidence is something, including testimony, documents, and tangible objects, that tends to prove or disprove the existence of an alleged fact. So it doesn't say it necessarily proves it, it just tends to prove it. So it doesn't have to lead you to a final conclusion, it just might push you a little further in the direction of a conclusion. And what is proof? Well, proof is the establishment or refutation of an alleged fact by evidence, the persuasive effect of evidence in the mind of a fact finder. So usually it will take many pieces of evidence to amount to a proof. So just because you see something and it doesn't solve the question conclusively doesn't mean that it's not evidence. You just may need more evidence to actually get to the point where you feel that you have proof. Now, I'm going to look at some of the evidence that Justice Stevens found particularly significant, and these that you see before you are the 6 accepted signatures of William Shakespeare of Stratford. Now, you may wonder that I'm not saying Shakespeare. Well, as best as you can tell from the handwritings here, he doesn't put an E after the K, and so it probably would have been pronounced Shakespeare, not the way that it was spelled on the works that were published during that time. And it looks like the person who wrote these signatures had some difficulty writing. This was not lost on Jane Cox, the custodian of wills at the Public Records Office in London, who says it is obvious at a glance that these signatures, with the exception of the last 2, are not the signatures of the same man. Almost every letter is formed a different way in each. literate men in the 16th and 17th centuries developed personalized signatures, much as people do today, and it is unthinkable that Shakespeare did not. Which of the signatures reproduced here is the genuine article is anybody's guess. And perhaps what Jane Cox doesn't say, somewhat diplomatically, is that maybe none of these is actually his signatures. All of these happen to be on legal documents, so it's quite possible that there was a law clerk there who wrote his name for him, which they would often do for people who could not write their own names. So that brings up the question that if he had trouble writing his own name, how did he write Hamlet? Now, an interesting topic and a tricky topic when we're talking about the law of evidence is absence of evidence. And I want to quote a Stratfordian professor here, Sir Jonathan Bate. And in the film Last Will and Testament, he said, "Arguments based on the absence of evidence. That's dangerous." Now, what he's doing here is he's paraphrasing a well-known maxim: absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. And that statement is literally true as far as it goes. Just because we don't have evidence about something doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Maybe the evidence got lost. Maybe it got destroyed. Maybe it was overlooked or misinterpreted. Maybe people didn't know where to look for it. But let's remember this. People who say absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence don't usually go around saying that if they have good evidence. I mean, if you have good evidence, you say, here's the evidence. So let's also look at this jury instruction. This is used in federal court, and similar instructions are used in many jurisdictions. A reasonable doubt may arise not only from the evidence produced, but also from a lack of evidence. So we can take into account when there's a lack of evidence. And this is from Copey's Introduction to Logic. He said, in some circumstances, it can be safely assumed that if a certain event had occurred, evidence of it could be discovered by qualified investigators. So keep that phrase in mind, qualified investigators. In such circumstances, it's perfectly reasonable to take the absence of proof of its occurrence as positive proof of its non-occurrence. Now, is there an absence of evidence that, even though we've had qualified investigators looking for it? Well, here's a statement from another Oxford professor, Hugh Trever Roper, history professor, and he found Shakespeare's elusiveness exasperating and almost incredible. After all, he lived in the full daylight of the English Renaissance, in the well-documented reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James I. And since his death, has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research that has ever been directed upon a single person. Now, what he's talking about here is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, English scholars descended upon Stratford and London and points in between and ransacked village archives looking for any scrap of paper they could find that would explain to them how this man of humble origins came to write these great plays with so much knowledge in them. And they didn't find anything that really shed light on his creativity. And as Trever Roper goes on to say, and yet the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted. Now, Shakespeare scholars will tell you that it's a fact that William Shakespeare of Stratford had a very good education acquired in the Stratford Grammar School. This is from Lewis Wright, formerly a director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. And this struck me as odd because I know that elsewhere, Lewis Wright said that there is no evidence that would stand up in a court of law that anyone else wrote the plays that have been attributed to Shakespeare. Well, that's kind of interesting because there's no evidence that would stand up in a court of law that William Shakespeare ever went to the Stratford Grammar School. It's assumed that he did, but it's not really proved. There's no student records. They don't have a list of students' names. And there's no extrinsic evidence that you might expect, like maybe a letter or an entry in a diary from one of his schoolmates or from a schoolmaster. Nothing. So we really can't say with any certainty that he actually went to that school. Now, what documentary evidence do we have of Shakespeare's life? Well, actually, there are quite a lot of documents. About 90 documents exist from his life. They tell us about his baptism, his marriage, the birth of his children, his money lending, lawsuits, tax records, grain hoarding. There are also records of his being a theater shareholder and a sometime actor, a couple of records of his having acted, and he left some bequests to fellow actors in his will and died in 1616. But here's the big gap in the evidence. None of the documents from his life identifies him as a writer of any kind. Now, you might want to ask this question. Isn't there a lack of evidence of education or of a literary career for other Elizabethan writers? And that question occurred to this woman, Diana Price, who wrote the book that you see on the left, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, first published in 2001. And Diana Price set out to find literary paper trails not only for Shakespeare, but for 24 other Elizabethan writers, and she was doing a comparative study. And what would be an example of a literary paper trail? Well, she came up with 10 possible types. For example, evidence of being paid to write, handwritten matters concerning literary work, miscellaneous records referring to the person as a writer, and notice at death as a writer. Usually when a writer died, fellow authors would write tributes to him. Now, this is the list of 24 authors that Diana Price studied, and I'm going to show you a number next to each name, and that number is the number of types of literary paper trail that she found for each of these 24 authors. Now, up at the top of the list is Ben Jonson, for whom there are all 10 types of literary paper trail. His writing career is very well documented. And then it goes all the way down to John Webster, for whom there are still at least 3 different types of documents from his lifetime verifying that he was a writer. And then there is Shakespeare, for whom there is 0 from his lifetime. So what we have here, I see that you recognize this. This is the dog that didn't bark from the Sherlock Holmes story, Silver Blaze, where, as you may remember that the fact that the dog did not bark in the night was a clue. Well, it ought to be a clue here that you have a difficult time finding dogs that bark that William Shakespeare was Shakespeare. So was this a literary man? Well, there's no evidence of education, no letter exists from him, there's no evidence he ever owned a book. In his will, there's no mention of books or manuscripts. No one in Stratford referred to him as a literary man during his lifetime. His son-in-law, a physician, never mentioned in his detailed diary that his wife's father was a playwright. There's a dog that didn't bark. And here's another one. When he died in 1616, there were no eulogies from other writers, no tributes. So Diana Price's challenge is that if writing plays were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that William Shakespeare was guilty. Your Honor, my client is guilty. You can't prove he could even write his name or that he ever owned a book, let alone that he wrote any plays. So what about references to Shakespeare's works by other writers in the 1590s and early 1600s? Don't those identify the Stratford man as the author William Shakespeare? Well, no, actually. As Stanley Wells, a staunch Stratfordian academic, admits, there's no evidence before 1623 that identifies Shakespeare with Stratford-upon-Avon. And also, it's good to remember that the Elizabethan age was part of a golden age of pseudonyms, a time when almost every writer used a pseudonym at some time or other during his career. So the idea that the name William Shakespeare was somebody's pen name is not really a radical idea at all. Well, so why do people think that Shakespeare was Shakespeare? Well, I'm just going to concentrate on what is by far the most important piece of evidence, and that is the First Folio, which was published in 1623 with William Shakespeare's plays, and also prefatory material, largely written by Ben Jonson. Many people think that he not only wrote most of it, but ghost wrote other parts of it. And it does mention, in the prefatory materials, Avon, and about 3 pages later, it mentions Stratford, although it doesn't mention them in the same breath. So that appears to be a kind of oblique reference to Stratford-upon-Avon. But since I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to concentrate on what I think is the most important misdirection in the First Folio. And it starts with this famous line from Ben Jonson, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." And this has, of course, been taken out of context to mean that Jonson was implying that the man who wrote these plays did not have much classical training, not much education. And then there's another passage from his fellow actors, Hemmings and Condell. Apparently they are supposed to have written this passage. And it says, "Shakespeare, as he was a happy imitator of nature, was a most gentle expresser of it. His mind and hand went together, and what he thought, he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him, a blot in his papers." Now, what these two passages together are trying to convey is the idea that Shakespeare was just this poor country bumpkin, didn't have much book learning. He just wrote whatever came into his head. It was like God was whispering in his ear as he wrote. Well, that's kind of interesting, and of course we know that's not exactly true because there are different versions of the plays. We know that they went through many revisions. So this idea about he scarcely blotted out a line doesn't really stand up. And even modern day academics try to bolster this idea that Shakespeare was ignorant. And this is again from Lewis Wright, formerly of the Folger Shakespeare Library. "The facts are that the plays show no evidence of profound book learning." No evidence of profound book learning. Really? Well, you might want to try this experiment. Go to a major university library and find the stacks where they keep the Shakespeare books. And you'll probably find several rows of bookcases with works about Shakespeare, many of them interpreting his works, but many of them also analyzing Shakespeare's knowledge in particular technical areas. And I have some experience with this because I have taught a course on Shakespeare and the law at the University of Miami School of Law, and we would spend an entire semester going through 6 or 7 Shakespeare plays and several sonnets and look for legal imagery, legal plot twists, legal themes that underlie the works. And there are about 50 books written about Shakespeare's knowledge of the law, most of them by lawyers. And there are no books written on Christopher Marlowe's knowledge of the law, or Ben Jonson's knowledge of the law, or any other Elizabethan playwright. Shakespeare is unique in that respect. And Shakespeare even parodies a law case in the play Hamlet. The law case of Hales versus Pettit, which was decided in 1562, is parodied in the jargon of the gravediggers in Hamlet. And in order to read the original opinion, to read the reports on it, you would have had to have been able to read law French, which was the corrupted version of Norman French that was the official language of the law in Shakespeare's time. And it's not just Shakespeare's knowledge of law that's impressive. Books and articles have been written on Shakespeare's knowledge of medicine, several books on that, hunting, falconry, horsemanship, military life, military tactics, military equipment. You may notice that many of these are noblemen's pastimes, philosophy, commedia dell'arte, navigation, classical mythology, folklore, biblical lore, plants, animals, agriculture, gardening, music, heraldry, precious stones, Italy, Greek drama, typography, and, as I mentioned, law French. And what do all these topics have in common? They were not taught at the Stratford Grammar School. So this is what I call the Shakespeare conundrum. In order to believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, you'd have to suppose that the son of illiterate parents, for whom there's no evidence that he ever went to school, ever wrote a letter, or ever owned a book, somehow attained a world-class education that included fluency in several languages, a deep understanding of a great many technical subjects, that list I just showed you, thereby becoming one of the most literate people of the Elizabethan age, actually probably one of the most literate people who ever lived, and gained all this knowledge without leaving a clue as to how he did it. It's not that a person of humble origins could not gain all that knowledge somehow but how did he do it without leaving any traces behind of how he did it? Again, Diana Price's challenge. If writing plays were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that William Shakespeare was guilty. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the case for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Now, the case for him is based on circumstantial evidence. So I want to talk about direct versus circumstantial evidence. What is direct evidence? Well, it's evidence that's based on personal knowledge or observation, and that, if true, proves a fact without inference or presumption. Now, when I say if true, that's a big if, because it may not be true. The evidence may be mistaken. But let's take an example here. The witness testifies, "I saw the defendant shoot the victim." Okay, well, if you think the witness is credible, then that would solve the matter. That would mean that the defendant did shoot the victim. But what if the witness is mistaken? What if the witness is lying? Believe it or not, witnesses do sometimes lie. Now, circumstantial evidence is evidence of some collateral fact from which the existence or non-existence of some fact in question may be inferred as a probable consequence. So here are some examples. Let's say the defendant made prior threats to the victim. His fingerprints were found at the scene of the crime. He was the owner of the murder weapon, and he was seen in the neighborhood where the crime occurred around the time that it happened. Those might be enough, depending on how good each piece of evidence is, that might be enough to amount to proof or to a conviction. Now, J. Thomas Looney, the man who wrote the book that we are here to celebrate, that was published 100 years ago today, was a schoolmaster, but I think he had a very good definition, very good layman's definition of circumstantial evidence. He said that circumstantial evidence is in practice the most reliable proof we have. The predominating element in what we call circumstantial evidence is that of coincidences. A few coincidences we may treat as simply interesting, a number of coincidences we regard as remarkable, a vast accumulation of extraordinary coincidences we accept as conclusive proof. It is not upon any point separately, but upon the manner in which all fit in with one another and form a coherent whole that the case rests. Now, you may hear people say, "Oh, well, that's only circumstantial evidence," as if somehow circumstantial evidence is not really evidence at all. So let's clear up a few points about direct and circumstantial evidence. First of all, evidence is evidence. In a court of law, there's usually no need to distinguish that this is circumstantial and this is direct. If it meets the requirements of the rules of evidence, then it comes in and the jury gets to see it. And in most trials, you will have both direct and circumstantial evidence. And most cases, not all, but most, may be proved entirely by circumstantial evidence. And maybe most important of all, direct evidence is not necessarily better or more persuasive than circumstantial evidence. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we've got a paternity case. Okay, here's one right out of the tabloids. "Justin Bieber is the father of my baby." Well, looks like Justin's going to have to get a DNA test. Okay, so you're going to have a couple of types of evidence here, and one of them is the mother's testimony, and that's direct evidence because she was there when it happened and she would know. And she can testify as to who she did or did not have intercourse around the time that the child would have been conceived. And then we have a DNA test. And this is a biological test that is performed on the child and the purported father. And then from that evidence, you have basically circumstantial evidence from which a scientist who's trained in this can give you the probability that the person in question was the father of the child. So what happens if the results from the testimony are different from the results of the DNA test? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going with the DNA test, even though that's circumstantial evidence, because the DNA test does not have a motive to lie. The mother might. So let's look at some of the circumstantial evidence for Oxford. And I've only got a few minutes, so I'll just give a few examples, but there's plenty more. In 1589, the anonymous book, The Art of English Poesy, said that there are noblemen who have written excellently well, as it would appear, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford. So we know that he was writing and that he was trying to keep it hidden from people. And also in 1598, Francis Meyers said that Oxford was one of the best writers of comedy. Well, that's interesting. We don't have any plays that have come down to us, any comedies that have come down to us under his name. What happened to them? We know that Ovid's Metamorphoses was a major influence on Shakespeare's works. And we also know that Shakespeare was influenced by not only the Latin original, but also by an English translation by Arthur Golding. Well, Arthur Golding just happened to be Oxford's uncle. And he happened to be living in the same household with Golding at the time that Golding was working on the book. Speaking of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the first work published under the name of William Shakespeare is a long narrative poem called Venus and Adonis. And in it, Shakespeare describes Adonis as wearing a bonnet. Now that suggests that Shakespeare, whoever he was, saw the painting that you see on the left there, which is by the great Venetian painter Titian. Now he painted several versions of the Venus and Adonis story. This is the only one where Adonis is wearing a bonnet. And in order to see this version, you would have had to go to Titian's studio in Venice. Now, we don't have any record of William of Stratford ever leaving England, let alone traveling to Italy, but we do know that Oxford traveled extensively in Italy, and particularly in Venice. Now, here we have an actor playing the role of Polonius, and Polonius has long been recognized as a parody on this man, Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh. Now, Lord Burleigh was first Oxford's guardian from the age of 12 when Oxford's father died, and later he became Oxford's father-in-law when Oxford married his daughter Anne. And Lord Burleigh's maxims are parodied in Hamlet. For example, when Polonius says to his son Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be. This is basically parodying something that Lord Burleigh said in his maxims, which of course Oxford was familiar with because he lived in Lord Burleigh's household. And this is Lord Burleigh's coat of arms, and you can see his motto down at the bottom, cor unum via una, one heart, one way. One heart, one way. Now, you may not know this little tidbit, but in the first quarto of Hamlet, the first published version of it, there was no character named Polonius. He was called Corambus. Corambus, which is basically a pun on cor unum, means two hearts. It's like his heart is not true. He's deceitful. And so I think this was probably a little too obvious a reference to Lord Burleigh, and so the name was changed later on, in the later versions, to Polonius. There's a plot twist in Hamlet, where Hamlet is captured by pirates who leave him naked on the shore of Denmark. Well, Edward de Vere was crossing the English Channel when he too was captured by pirates who left him naked on the shore of England. But that's probably just a coincidence. Young men falling out at tennis, that's a line from Hamlet, also probably refers to a famous quarrel that occurred on a tennis court between Oxford and his great rival, Sir Philip Sidney. Cardano's Comfort. This book says, what should we account of death to be resembled to anything better than a sleep? We are assured not only to sleep, but also to die. Now, this may remind you of Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. To die, to sleep no more. Well, we know that Oxford was familiar with this book because he wrote a preface to it when he was age 22. On the left, you have Henry Risley, the third Earl of Southampton, and this is the person to whom Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece were dedicated. And those are the first two works published under the name William Shakespeare. Many people also believe that he's the fair youth of the sonnets. Now, it seems rather odd that a commoner like William Shakespeare would write sonnets to a young nobleman encouraging him to get married, but that's what happens in the first 17 sonnets. Isn't that a little presumptuous for a commoner to say to a nobleman, especially a young nobleman like this? Well, perhaps we can understand it better if you're aware of the fact that around the time the sonnets were probably written, Lord Burleigh was trying to get Southampton to marry Oxford's daughter. Lord Burleigh, of course, was the grandfather of the girl. And so the sonnets would make much more sense if you see them as coming from an older nobleman to a younger nobleman, encouraging him to be his son-in-law. Now, circumstantial evidence for Oxford. Here is the Geneva Bible that Oxford owned, and this now resides in the Folger Shakespeare Library here in D.C. And of course, Roger Strittmatter is going to be talking about this in more detail later on. But Roger did his PhD dissertation on correlations between markings in Oxford's Geneva Bible and biblical allusions in Shakespeare's works. So again, there's more circumstantial evidence tying Shakespeare's works to Oxford. And this room that you're looking at is called the Sala di Troia, the Room of Troy, in the Ducal Palace in Mantua, Italy, which is an area where Oxford traveled on his tour of Italy. And it's painted by Giulio Romano, who is the only artist mentioned by name in Shakespeare's works. He's mentioned in The Winter's Tale. And in another of Shakespeare's works, The Rape of Lucrece, after Lucrece has been raped, she goes into a room, and the poem spends about 200 lines describing pictures of the Trojan War that are seen on the walls of the room that she's in. And it appears to be that the poem is describing this room that we see pictured here. So as I said, the man from Stratford never traveled out of England that we know of, but we know that Oxford was in this part of the world. Now, if you're still torn between Oxford and Shakespeare, maybe this will serve as a tiebreaker. This is the dedication page to Shakespeare's Sonnets, published in 1609. And you'll notice near the middle of the page, it mentions our ever-living poet. Our ever-living poet. Well, in those days, the phrase ever-living was used to refer to people who were no longer living. They would live on in our memories, or they would live on in their works. So ever-living would refer to somebody who was already dead at the time that this was written. So Oxford had already died in 1604. The Stratford man was still alive and would live until 1616. And the Stratfordians have never been able to explain why this would refer to the man from Stratford. And I want to quote from Sigmund Freud. I know Jim mentioned this statement from him. Freud said, "I no longer believe that the actor from Stratford was the author of the works that have been ascribed to him. The man of Stratford seems to have nothing at all to justify his claim, whereas Oxford has almost everything." And Freud said this after reading Shakespeare Identified by J.T. Looney. And as Justice Stevens says, the evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not the man from Stratford. I'd like to thank you, Justice Stevens, for following the evidence where it led. And thank you, John Thomas Looney. And thank you.
I'm an Oxfordian, I admit it. I'd like to play the devil's advocate, though.
Okay.
The single greatest piece of evidence in favor of William Shakespeare is still his name. It is attached to the plays, and it's not just Shakespeare or Shakespeare, and we don't know his exact spelling because none of his signatures are clear, and he couldn't spell his name anyway. So we don't really know about the spelling, but it's also William Shakespeare. It's not just Shakespeare. And that is evidence. It is evidence, whether we like it or not, it's evidence.
Right.
So the question is, and I don't have an answer for this, he must be somewhere involved in this whole tapestry of intrigue. Where is he? How do we make the connection and put him in the perspective of all of De Vere's work, and his name is somehow attached? I mean, that has to be explained.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's first of all, his name was not Shakespeare. On his birth records and death records in Stratford-upon-Avon, it is Shakespeare with S-H-A-K and no E after it. And the during his lifetime, you'll very seldom see it spelled the way it is on the books, which seems extremely odd. If he was making a name for himself as a playwright and poet, why would he not use the same name that's being used on the published works? As for how he's involved in this, that is the big question that I don't think anybody knows. And there are two theories, really. One is that he was a posthumous stand-in, that because he was an actor and because his name was similar to the pen name that Oxford was using, and there are good reasons for his having chosen that as a pen name, regardless of whether he was familiar with the Stratford man, but that maybe he was chosen as a stand-in afterwards so that people would not connect the works with Oxford. The other one is that maybe he pretended to be the author and that he was a play broker and he would put his name on other people's works that didn't want to have their names put on them. And I don't think there's enough evidence either way. I think, though, what's interesting to me is Diana Price's whole point that you don't have anybody referring to him as a writer during his lifetime. So I think that's a difficulty with the front man theory, if you want to call it that. But I don't know. I'm torn between the two ideas, and it's just it's something that we keep looking for more evidence about.
Tom, as you say, there were no tributes or eulogies when Will Shakespeare died. Yeah. Tell me, but there were no eulogies or tributes when Oxford died. So talking to friends about this subject, I rarely bring up the former because I can't explain the latter.
Okay. Well, because Oxford was basically trying to keep his writing of the plays secret. He's what? Okay, why would he keep it secret? That's a good question. There are a lot of reasons. First of all, there was something in those days called the stigma of print for noblemen. Now, if you were a nobleman and you wrote a scientific work or a law treatise or something like that, that was fine. But writing poetry was considered frivolous. And writing plays, especially if they were performed in the public theaters, that was even worse. That was scandalous, because those were places where there was thievery and prostitution and gambling going on. So a nobleman would not want to have something commercially published that had his name on it and that was going to be associated with the public theaters. So that was one reason. And another reason is that he was satirizing people in the court. As I mentioned, Lord Burleigh, his father-in-law, he's satirizing him. Queen Elizabeth is satirized. Philip Sidney is satirized. Christopher Hatton, these people are all satirized in the plays, and you understand that once you think of Oxford as the author. So if it's public knowledge that he's writing these plays, then it's much more obvious who he's satirizing. Yes?
I meant not about Oxford as a writer, but there were no tributes or eulogies or a funeral or anything about Oxford when he died.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. He was living kind of an obscure life towards the end of his life. He was, he'd been disgraced in court on a number of occasions, and I think he was living more of a reclusive life at that time. So, but I can't tell you the details on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the very fact that when Oxford, a leading nobleman, died, there wasn't comment is an indication that something was fishy and that something was suspicious. So it does synergize and is another corroborating circumstance that there was something going on we don't know about. And his anonymous writings that could have been viewed as scandalous could well be part of the explanation for that excellent point. So just wanted to thought.
Yes, well, also some people have pointed out, I believe, that after his death, King James had several Shakespeare plays performed at court, which may have been a kind of silent tribute to him, knowing that he was the author. Yes, Markley.
You had a fascinating quotation from Stanley Wells, the guardian of the Stratford Monument. That quotation was to the effect that there is no evidence. Am I paraphrasing this correctly? That Stanley Wells said there is no evidence for the Stratford man, or no hard evidence?
There's no evidence tying the Stratford man to the works of Shakespeare until 1623, when the First Folio is published. Up till then, references to Shakespeare, people are talking about Shakespeare's works, they talk about Shakespeare's sonnets, Shakespeare's plays. Nobody ever ties that to the man from Stratford as the author. And I think it's pretty clear that there's no evidence that anybody thought he was the writer during his lifetime, which is odd because one of the things that the Stratfordians will say is, oh, everybody thought of him as the author back then. There's no evidence that anybody thought of him as the author back then.
It seems to me there's a good argument for the Oxfordians there.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My understanding is that at the end of his life, he had his 1,000-pound annuity. He'd remarried happily to Elizabeth Tresham, whose brother was helping him sort out his financial fiascos.
Yes.
And that he had retired from court.
Yes.
So he was living a happy, quiet life in the country.
Yes. As far as I know, that's correct.
Wonderful talk, Tom, as always.
Thank you.
I can tell you're an actor. Much to my surprise, I'm feeling a little concerned we're being unfair to the Stratfordians here. So I just want to say, although they may not be good at history, they are superb at rewriting history, and we need to give them credit for that. It was said by Sidney Lee around 1899 that Oxford wrote verse of much lyric beauty. And about 50 years later, the wonderful English historian Baron Macaulay had said the same thing, that he was one of the top writers of the Elizabethan age. What happened after 1920 that he was no longer such a great writer? Similarly, as you said, people who wrote about Hamlet in the 19th century were in agreement. There was consensus that Polonius was a transparent spoof of Lord Burleigh. After 1920, no, that history was rewritten, and major Stratfordians have claimed no one ever thought that. So give them their due.
Thanks, Rick.